Southern Fried True Crime covers cases that are not suitable for young listeners, and there may also be some explicit language used. I discuss sexual assault in today's episode, and it may be distressing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. In 1748, Voltaire wrote of the great principle that is better to run the risk of sparing the guilty than to condemn the innocent. At about the same time, William Blackstone wrote, "The law holds that it is better that 10 guilty persons escape than one innocent suffer." Most of us can quote Blackstone in our sleep. It is the basic tenet of our justice system. At least, it's supposed to be. Somewhere along the line between Voltaire and the Central Park 5 case, the American justice system became more interested in getting a conviction at any cost. Tunnel vision by investigators is not uncommon and can lead to coercive interrogation tactics, many of which are not illegal. Police can lie to a suspect. Outside of the use of physical force, there's not much a skilled interrogator can't try. Most of us believe we would never confess to a crime we didn't commit, not under any circumstances. But you would be surprised at what psychological coercion can do to your brain. And after how many hours without food, water, or sleep would you break? After many high-profile cases with false confessions, like the Central Park 5, reform began in the 1990s. Interrogations began being recorded. Over half the states in our country now require recording of certain custodial interrogations. Today's case is a textbook example of police forcing confessions to fit their theory of a crime. Faced with contradictory evidence, they maintained their original suspect and sought to prove there was more than one suspect in this case. 8 men would be accused of the rape and murder of Michelle Moore-Bosco. Only 1 man was guilty, but 4 innocent men would be convicted and spend decades trying to clear their names. Welcome to episode 138, the case of the Norfolk 4. Michelle Lynn Moore-Bosco was born on August 19, 1978 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. To parents Jack and Carol, she had 2 younger brothers and grew up in Pittsburgh. Michelle's friends described her as a sweet girl who was quietly funny and a little goofy. According to her parents, Michelle had a very sheltered upbringing. She loved country music, line dancing, and going fishing with her dad. She also dearly loved her high school sweetheart, William Bosko, known as Billy. In 1996, they graduated from Keystone Oaks High School. Billy joined the Navy, and Michelle soon followed him to Norfolk, Virginia. She had studied cosmetology and vocational education classes in high school, and her parents hoped that she would follow that dream, not Billy. It wasn't that they necessarily disliked Billy. It was just that Michelle was so very young. But Michelle was determined to be with Billy, and they secretly wed on April 4th, 1997, when she was there on a weekend trip. She moved to Norfolk on May 31st, though she told her parents that she was moving in with a girlfriend. Instead, the newlyweds got a 700-square-foot apartment on West Bay Avenue. The apartment was on the first floor and was within walking distance of the naval base. Billy later said he and Michelle planned to have a big wedding in Pittsburgh in October, but they eloped because they wanted to be together and because Billy was going to be gone a lot for the Navy. He wanted Michelle on his insurance in case anything happened. Michelle's mother would later say that Michelle was not ready to move. She was too young and had never been away from home before. She talked to her mom on the phone every day, and she was afraid of being alone. Michelle was young and in love. She probably never considered what her life might be like in Norfolk, that she would be alone so much. It's no surprise that she became friendly with a few neighbors. She was also looking for a job and had recently been hired at a McDonald's. She seemed to have started to acclimate. She was trying so hard. On July 8, 1997, Billy Bosko returned from a week at sea on the USS Simpson. He was surprised that Michelle wasn't waiting on the pier for him, but he thought maybe she had started her new job at McDonald's. He hopped in a cab and went home. He found Michelle's body in their tiny bedroom. She was lying on her back, on the floor, wearing only a black t-shirt. There was a lot of blood. She had been strangled and stabbed multiple times. She was cold to the touch, and her eyes were open. But still, Billy tried to find a pulse and then threw a blanket over the bottom part of her body that was exposed. In his panic, Billy couldn't find their portable phone. He ran across the hall to his neighbor, Daniel Williams's apartment, to use his phone. Billy was in shock and just kept saying, "My wife is dead. My wife is dead." Dan called 911, then followed Billy back into the apartment. He saw Michelle's body, and then the two men waited for police. When police arrived, they noted there was no forced entry. The furniture in the living and dining room area had not been moved or knocked over. There were CDs and a CD case on the living room floor. The table beside the couch had a lamp and a drinking glass on it. In the kitchen, there was a broken egg on the floor and a frying pan on the stove. 2 chairs were pulled out at the dining table. The only sign of a disturbance was on the dining room table. Michelle's purse had been dumped there and rifled through. Down the narrow hallway to the bedroom, the shelves were not disturbed. There were all kinds of everyday things, seeming to be delicately balanced in the small space, and nothing was disturbed. According to a crime scene reconstruction report, intact piles of mail, bills, a checkbook, 3 pairs of eyeglasses, and a full mail organizer were precariously balanced and jutting into the hallway from shelves between the kitchen and hall. In the bedroom, none of the furniture was disturbed. None of the fragile items sitting on furniture had been knocked over, even though Michelle's body was mere inches away. The bedroom dimensions were about 12 by 16 feet, but the space where Shannon was attacked was limited to about 7 by 7 feet by the furniture. There was an intact, delicately balanced full-length mirror 1 foot from Michelle. There were delicately balanced items on a dressing table next to her. I'm sorry, it's the report that uses that phrase, delicately balanced, over and over. Put simply, in a tiny 700 square foot apartment, every space was used. Some of it was everyday items, some mementos. But all of it was the type of stuff you would find all over the place if a violent struggle had taken place. This is a really important point, since police would later claim up to 8 men were involved in the attack. There was blood pooled around Michelle's body. It was not smeared or disturbed. Next to Michelle's body was a brown kitchen knife with ridges. It was a 4.5-inch blade, bent to nearly a 90-degree angle. The knife had come from Michelle's kitchen. Her legs were still spread apart when her body was found, with her underwear inside out nearby. DNA, which included blood and semen, was found in 3 locations: under Michelle's fingernails, on a blanket near Michelle's body, and inside Michelle. The DNA belonged to only one person. 12 fingerprints of value were found. 6 were Michelle's, and 6 belonged to someone else. Michelle had 4 stab wounds, all clustered in a 2.75-inch by 2-inch area on her left chest. One of them was only a 1/2 inch in depth. The other 3 were 5 inches deep, and all consistent in their direction, size, and depth. These wounds pierced her lungs, which caused her to drown in her own blood. There were also 5 knife-point abrasions found on Michelle's chest, like perhaps someone had held a knife to her chest to control her. Michelle more than likely had complied with her attacker before she was murdered. There were no signs of a struggle, and she did not have defensive wounds. She had been manually strangled and was probably unconscious when she was stabbed. She had bruising around her throat and petechial hemorrhages in her eyes. Vaginal injuries showed that she had been raped by one person. You may ask how the medical examiner came to this conclusion. For one reason, there was only one DNA sample. The other is more disturbing. The kind of injuries a woman would suffer from gang rape were not present. Autopsy results showed that only one person was responsible for Michelle's rape and murder. The medical examiner never wavered on this stance, and later, other forensic specialists all agreed that Michelle had been raped and murdered by only one man. And initially, detectives also theorized only one attacker. They believed Michelle knew her killer and let him inside. This was a crime of opportunity. Michelle's killer did not bring a weapon with him. He took it from her kitchen. With the way the chairs were pulled out, she had likely invited him to sit down as she was preparing a meal. Whether it was for him, her, or both is uncertain. But something happened in that kitchen that made Michelle drop the egg on the floor. Then she ran from the kitchen, down the hall into her bedroom, with the killer on her heels. He caught Michelle in the bedroom, but it's not like she had anywhere else to run. He would have been blocking the only exits in the tiny apartment. I'll have a diagram of the crime scene so you can see for yourself. The killer grabbed the back of her shirt and pulled her toward him. Michelle lost her footing on the polished floors and fell backwards. Her killer used a combination of choking and slight knife jabs to control Michelle. He took off her pants and underwear, then vaginally raped her. Then, probably because he knew she could identify him, he stabbed her to death. It's possible this man had never stabbed anyone before because the first wound was only a half-inch deep. But then he stabbed her 3 more times, at around 5 inches deep, perforating her lungs. Michelle then started coughing up blood, which got onto her killer. We know because he then wiped his penis with his semen and the blood she coughed onto him on a nearby blanket and left the bedroom. He then dumped her purse out on the table, pulled out a dining chair, sat down, and went through the contents before leaving. No resident in the apartment complex saw or heard a group of men in the hallways or parking lot. Police spoke with Michelle's parents and husband. They all said that when Billy was due home, Michelle would diligently clean their small home in her excitement, wanting everything to be perfect. They all confirmed that Michelle was scared to be alone at night, and that she would never open the door to someone she didn't know. They also spoke to her neighbor and best friend, Tamika Taylor. When asked if she could think of any suspects, Tamika told investigators that Michelle's neighbor, Dan Williams, seemed interested in or attracted to Michelle. Dan Williams was the neighbor Billy ran to when he found her body. He admitted to thinking Michelle was attractive, but that was it. Tamika said on the night of July 7th, Michelle was cleaning the apartment because Billy was coming home. She cleaned from 8 to 10:30 and then she went to Tamika's for a few minutes. She left by 11 p.m. and said she was going to keep cleaning, but she did say she was scared to go to her apartment by herself. This didn't come out until years later, but Tamika said she also told police about another man who should be looked into, Omar Ballard. She said Omar had recently gotten into trouble for beating a woman in the same apartment complex with a baseball bat. Tamika was friends with Omar Ballard and had introduced him to Michelle and Billy at the pool a few weeks before the murder. And Tamika was always over at Michelle's house, so Ballard would often go to Michelle's apartment to find Tamika. Michelle was comfortable enough with Omar Ballard to have let him in the apartment with no hesitation. Detectives ignored Tamika's other tip and didn't look into Omar Ballard, and they did not tell defense attorneys about this lead and never even questioned Ballard about Michelle's murder until 20 months later. If they would have looked into Ballard, they would have seen that on July 8th, he was arrested for assaulting a woman with the baseball bat, like Tamika had said. Ballard had a long criminal history and made much more sense as a suspect. Instead, detectives chose to focus on her neighbor, Daniel Williams. Dan Williams grew up in Owasso, Michigan, a small town located about 30 minutes west of Flint. Later, his attorneys would provide a biography that his childhood, quote, reflected the values common in small towns in the Midwest: personal responsibility, respect for rules, and deference to authority. Dan's parents expected him to obey their rules, and he did not stray from them. A close childhood friend of Dan's, named Jeff Campbell, said the Williams were kind of strict. Dan was taught responsibility. He was in the Boy Scouts, and he had a paper route to earn spending money. When he was old enough to drive, his parents bought him a cheap car, but he was responsible for gas and insurance. He was in the marching band in Owasso High School. Halfway through his senior year, Dan pre-enlisted in the Navy. In June 1991, right after graduating high school, Dan headed off for basic training. He was following a family tradition. All the men in his family enlisted. After boot camp, Dan was assigned to work as a machinist mate on the USS John F. Kennedy in Norfolk, Virginia. Between 1992 and 93, Dan traveled to the Mediterranean. He re-enlisted after his initial tour of duty, planning to make a career as a sailor. His superiors all repeatedly recommended him for advancement. They all said he was a valued sailor. In 1994, Dan was back in Norfolk. He met a woman named Nicole. They fell in love and had just gotten married when Michelle was murdered. As his attorneys would point out, he was the polar opposite of the kind of predator the police should have suspected, despite what Tamika said about him being attracted to Michelle. Of course they should have investigated him, but not only did he have no criminal record, much less anything violent in his past, he had an alibi: his wife. Dan and Nicole lived across the hallway from Michelle. They had married just 11 days before Michelle was raped and murdered, and by all accounts, they were very much in love. And there were other reasons Dan was not a great suspect. In June of 1997, Nicole had found out she had ovarian cancer. Dan requested leave from the Navy so he could take care of Nicole before and after her surgery to remove a tumor. He spent 12 hours a day at the hospital with her. On June 27th, they had married so she could be on his insurance for the surgery. On July 1st, Nicole underwent surgery and she was released to go home on July 6th. The surgeons thought they'd gotten all of the tumor, but still expected Nicole would need chemo. This was just a night before Michelle was attacked, and Dan and his wife also had company the next day. Everything about his background was wrong. His friends and family said he was shy, caring, and respectful. He was a sensitive person who cared about others' feelings. Jeff Campbell, Dan's childhood friend, said Dan always had respect for the police. He wasn't the kind of kid who would give anyone trouble. Jeff's dad was a police officer who later became deputy chief. It's possible that Dan's interactions with the dad led him to inherently trust the police. And there is one other aspect to Daniel Williams that is important. He was of below-average intelligence. Everyone who knew Dan Williams told his attorneys that he could be manipulated by an authority figure, like a strong police officer, into saying something that was not true, because of his limited intellectual ability, his low self-esteem, and his significant respect for and deference to authority. It's completely possible that Dan would confess to a crime he didn't commit. Pretty much everyone described Daniel Williams as being slow. He wasn't developmentally disabled. He was, quote, a half step off. Dan did struggle academically, but all of his teachers said he would try really hard and wouldn't get frustrated when he couldn't understand something. And while he struggled with his grades, he did always go to school. He had a perfect attendance record for all 4 years of high school. After Tamika Taylor told police that Daniel Williams seemed interested in Michelle, detectives showed up at his door on the afternoon of July 8th. They asked him to go to the station with them. Dan wanted to help, so he went. The interview was not recorded. At the station, 25-year-old Dan told two detectives that on July 7th, he and Nicole ate dinner with his parents who were visiting from Michigan. After dinner, he and Nicole returned home and went to sleep. No one ever spoke to Nicole about Dan's whereabouts on the night of July 7th, and she died about 3 months later. Dan said on the morning of the 8th, he and Nicole ran errands, including going to the Social Security office to officially change Nicole's last name. That afternoon, Dan's parents bought the newlyweds a coffee maker, microwave, and microwave cart for their apartment as a wedding gift. Nicole, Dan, and his parents spent the afternoon assembling the cart and putting up the new appliances. The questioning soon became an interrogation. Detectives were putting pressure on him and were telling him a lot of lies, like that they had witnesses who saw him leaving Michelle's apartment late at night after she had been murdered. Dan offered to take a polygraph, which he passed with flying colors. But detectives lied again and said he had failed. Every time Dan said he had no involvement with Michelle's rape and murder, the detectives called him a liar. He maintained his innocence for 9 hours of unrelenting police pressure. Then detectives went and grabbed another detective named Robert Glenn Ford, who was known to extract confessions. Once Glenn Ford was in the room, he threatened Dan with the death penalty if he didn't confess. If he did confess, he'd get a more lenient sentence, he promised. It took less than an hour for Ford to get Dan to confess. With the threat of the death penalty, Dan gave in and made a confession. He said he knocked on Michelle's door and hit her with his hand, then his fist, then his shoe. Then he said he did not strangle her, but he did rape her. While Dan was still in the interview room, detectives learned that Michelle had been raped and that she had been strangled on top of being stabbed. They now knew Dan's confession didn't match up with any of the evidence. Michelle was not beaten, not with a fist or a shoe. So they started feeding him facts about the case, adding in parts about rape and strangulation, and urged him to alter his confession to better match what really happened. Daniel Williams then provided a supplemental confession. In his supplemental confession, Dan agreed to using a knife he found lying in the bedroom to stab Michelle. However, he couldn't describe the knife, and it had actually been kept in the kitchen. Dan later told Time magazine that he was in a windowless room. The detectives were so aggressive with him that he started to question his own memory. Dan told the New York Times that Detective Glenn Ford poked him in the chest, yelled in his face, called him a liar, and said, "They wear you down to the point where you're exhausted. I just wanted the questioning to end." Daniel Williams was charged with Michelle's rape and murder. Every single person who knew him was shocked to hear that he had been charged. They felt down to their core that he would never hurt someone on purpose. But since the evidence at the scene proved that only one person was responsible, for the next 6 months, detectives considered the case closed. Daniel Williams raped and killed Michelle on his own. They never followed any other leads or looked for any other suspects. On November 2nd, Nicole Williams passed away from complications of ovarian cancer. Dan was not allowed to attend her funeral since he was being held without bail. On December 11th, 1997, the forensic lab told detectives that Daniel Williams' DNA was not a match for any evidence recovered from the crime scene. Also, when he was arrested, detectives took a pubic swab from Dan and they also swabbed his underwear. Michelle's DNA was not found. But it didn't matter to Norfolk detectives. They had their man, and they were going to make it stick. Daniel Williams was the first domino to fall. One of Dan's Navy buddies, Joe Dick, lived in the spare bedroom in the apartment Dan and Nicole shared. So police brought him in. He was domino number 2. After not being able to match Daniel Williams' DNA to Michelle or the crime scene, and Dan's refusal to accept a plea deal, authorities had to expand their theory on how Michelle was killed. They decided that Dan must have had some friends to help him, and it was their DNA at the scene. Detective Glenn Ford was now the lead investigator, and he was on a mission to find a match for the DNA. Detectives decided to start arresting other people. Joe Dick, Dan's roommate, was the next person. Joseph Jesse Dick Jr. was born and raised in Baltimore. His father was an Army vet. Like Dan, Joe was a Boy Scout. He was also an altar boy and church volunteer. And also like Dan, Joe exhibited developmental disabilities, though he was never really officially diagnosed. His intellectual as well as social development was severely stunted after a childhood accident when he was knocked unconscious by a swing. His disabilities, along with his last name, made Joe different. He was often bullied. But in spite of the problems he had, Joe was characterized by everyone who knew him to be a tremendously caring person. He always wanted to help people. Joe's parents, his mother especially, tried to help him with school. Family members thought he might have a learning disability, but didn't feel it was their place to question his parents. Joe grew up with loving parents, but they were also extremely strict and taught him absolute respect for authority. Joe both idolized and feared his father, who had made his career in the military. Joe lagged behind his peers academically and socially, but he was a very hard worker. But his developmental issues were apparent. In high school, he still enjoyed playing with Legos and G.I. Joes. Despite being stigmatized for being what society just called slow and for having the last name Dick, Joe was not an angry kid. He didn't lash out. Again, he was a helper. He volunteered at his church and in the Boy Scouts. But even with the simplest of tasks, he needed supervision. Friends, family, and educators said that Joe was easily manipulated and misled. And they doubted he would get into the military. Joe did fail the requirements for basic training on his first attempt, but he passed the second time and joined the Navy in early 1996. In the Navy, Joe's intellectual limitations continued to hamper his success. But his commitment and the strong efforts he put forth allowed him to receive acceptable scores on his evaluation reports. Joe was proud of his service, but he did remain immature and naive. Relatives remember that conversations with Joe, even after several years in the Navy, were like conversations with a 12-year-old, and his direct supervisor in the Navy recalls that Joe needed special guidance. He needed explicit instructions and supervision, but he was a good worker. Like Daniel Williams, Joe Dick had no criminal history. On January 12, 1998, detectives arrested 21-year-old Joe Dick and took him to the station for questioning. Joe told detectives, including Ford, that on July 7th, he was on duty on the ship. Basically, this meant that for 24 hours, he couldn't leave the ship. He ate and slept there, and he worked shifts where he stood watch. During this time, supervisors checked in 4 to 5 times to make sure soldiers were standing watch like they're supposed to. On top of that, they run different types of drills, which Joe would have been required to attend. The ship had 2 major exit points, and both were guarded 24/7. So basically, it was impossible for Joe to have snuck off the ship. Detectives told Joe that he was lying, that he hadn't been to work that day. But detectives were lying. They hadn't even tried to verify Joe's alibi. No one, not the investigators, his defense attorney, or the prosecutor, ever even interviewed Joe's supervisor to verify he was on duty the night of the murder. By the time anyone thought to check the ship's records to confirm Joe's whereabouts, the records had been destroyed. But keep this in your back pocket. After 8 hours of interrogation, Joe confessed. He said that Michelle led him and Dan into the apartment, and they attacked her in the living room, which was contrary to the crime scene. He said he accidentally stabbed Michelle, but that Dan intentionally stabbed her. He could not describe the knife or her wounds. He said that he and Dan both raped Michelle vaginally and orally, again, contrary to the autopsy results. And just like they had with Dan, detectives fed Joe facts about the case until his confession better lined up with the facts as they saw them. Joe then said he wiped his penis on the blanket and that they moved Michelle's body from the living room to the bedroom. After seeing a crime scene photo, he said they threw a blanket over Michelle before they left, but it was Billy, her husband, who had covered Michelle with a blanket. Joe later told the New York Times that Detective Ford kept taunting him, shouting at him, told him he was a liar, threatened him with the death penalty if he didn't cooperate. He again lied and said that Joe failed the polygraph he took. Joe Dick was charged with Michelle's rape and murder. Joe was the most important domino to fall in this unfolding investigation because he was the most vulnerable due to his intellectual disabilities. On March 26th, the forensic lab issued a report excluding Joe Dick as a match for the DNA found on Michelle and at the crime scene. So now, Detective Glenn Ford decided there must have been other friends with Dan and Joe that night. After all, he had their confessions, no matter how he got them, and he would not back down. Prior to the Norfolk 4 case, lead detective Robert Glenn Ford had a history of obtaining false confessions. In 1990, he coerced 3 teenagers into making confessions for a murder they couldn't possibly have committed. This is known as the Lafayette Grill case. He was suspended from the detective force for a few years and put back in uniform. In 1997, the same year as Michelle's murder, Ford elicited a coerced confession from an intellectually disabled person. Court records for that indictment are sealed. In April 1998, Detective Ford had an informant who was in jail with Joe to convince Joe to implicate others in the murder. Eventually, Joe named Eric Wilson, who was a friend of his. Eric Cameron Wilson was raised in South Texas. His father was a boilermaker and his mom taught 2nd grade. Like Daniel and Joe, he was active in his church, and serving in the military was extremely important to Eric. He enlisted right after graduating from high school. He also did not have a criminal history. On April 8, 1998, 21-year-old Eric Wilson was arrested and interrogated. Just like with Dan and Joe, Eric said he had no involvement. But after several hours of questioning, Eric said, quote, he often had a dream in which he had a glimpse of a female and that the dream was violent. After 6 more hours of intense interrogation, Eric confessed. His confession was similar to Joe's in that he said the attack started in the living room, again contrary to the crime scene. He said the 3 of them wrestled her into the bedroom. He said he and Daniel raped Michelle. Then he said no, he left before any rape happened. Then he changed his story again and said they all raped her, but he left before she was murdered. Eric later told the New York Times that Ford had physically hit him multiple times, showed him photos of the crime scene, and gave him details about the crime to include in his confession. Eric Wilson was also charged with rape and murder. On April 27th, Joe Dick was interrogated again. He said he would tell the truth this time. He gave another confession implicating himself, Dan, and Eric. On June 10th, 1998, the forensic lab report officially excluded Eric Wilson from the DNA found at the crime scene. That lab just never worked as quickly as Ford and the other detectives wanted. They would coerce a confession, make an arrest, and then the lab would exclude their latest suspect. So then they would work to find another suspect, interrogate their most vulnerable suspect, Joe Dick, repeatedly encouraging him to name other men. When you look at it like that, at the timeline, it's so preposterous. It's painfully obvious what is happening. Where are the checks and balances here? Why was Ford able to act with impunity? Well, you would think that would happen when the case was presented to the district attorney's office. But you would be wrong. Prosecutors don't usually want to go to court with so little evidence, but they did in this case. On June 16, 1998, Joe Dick was interrogated for a third time. He gave another confession, this time implicating himself, Williams, Wilson, and a Navy man named George Clark, and 2 other unknown white men. He said this Clark and Dan Williams planned the attack. He drew a composite of George Clark and said he may have served on the USS George Washington. When detectives found no record of a George Clark, they checked Dan Williams's visitor log at the jail. There was a woman who had come to see him. She was a Navy wife. It is assumed that she was just being friendly. This woman, however, said she did know a friend of Dan's who worked on the George Washington. His name was Derrick Tice. Later that day, detectives showed Joe an old yearbook from the GW. He chose Derrick Tice's photo, but said he was George Clark. Derrick Elliott Tice was born in San Diego because his father was stationed with the Navy there when he was born. His family eventually settled in North Carolina. Like the men before him, Derrick Tice was a Boy Scout with no criminal history. When he was in high school, his grandfather became seriously ill, and Derrick helped to care for him. This led him to volunteering as an emergency medical technician before he enlisted in the Navy with his ultimate goal of becoming a nurse. Derrick Tice is described as being caring, shy, respectful, generous, and compassionate. Everyone who knew him said he would give you the shirt off his back. His superiors said he was obedient and respectful. The oldest of the Norfolk 4, Derrick was out of the Navy and living in Florida when Norfolk detectives knocked on his door. Detective Ford went personally to pick him up. Derrick insisted he was innocent, and Ford kept telling him he would get the needle and die if he didn't tell the truth. Derrick asked for an attorney multiple times and was refused. This was a blatant violation of his Miranda rights. At around 1:45 a.m., after almost 20 hours of being with Detective Glenn Ford, Derrick Tice finally broke and confessed. He named yet another supposed accomplice, Jeff Ferris. And as usual, when his story didn't line up with the facts, Ford coached him into a more accurate confession. So Derrick changed his story again and added another man, Richard Pauley, and gave yet another description of the crime that was implausible. He said they broke into Michelle's apartment with a claw hammer, but investigators knew there was no forced entry to the Bosko apartment. Derrick said after they forced their way in, they took turns raping her and then handed the knife around, taking turns stabbing Michelle. Not only did the autopsy show that only one man raped Michelle, it showed one man stabbed her. Michelle had 3 penetrating stab wounds that were all clustered in a 2.75-inch by 2-inch area on her left chest. These wounds were 5 inches deep, equally distanced, and in the same direction. The killer had rapidly stabbed Michelle 3 times in a row. It was completely impossible for more than one person to have stabbed her with these results, let alone up to 8 men passing around a knife, taking turns stabbing her. Derrick Tice later told Time magazine, "In the light of day, you say you wouldn't confess, but in that room with the detective standing over you, you get worn down." Derrick told the New York Times that Ford treated him the same as other defendants, belligerent, accusatory, threatening. Ford gave him details to use in his confession. Derrick Tice was charged with rape and murder. The difference with the men Derrick Tice implicated was simple. They both had alibis and refused to confess. And Detective Ford did not try to push these men after they asked for attorneys, likely because they were not as easy to manipulate. 26-year-old Richard Pauley was an ex-soldier. He was at his parents' house and on the internet chatting with his girlfriend in Australia during the time frame of the crime. He also happened to be Nicole Williams' ex-husband. Despite his refusal to confess and his alibi, he was charged with rape and murder. 23-year-old Jeff Ferris, also named by Derrick Tice, and also an ex-soldier, was living in Virginia Beach. He was arrested and interrogated. He had an alibi. He willingly gave a blood sample and took a polygraph. He refused to confess, and when detectives said he failed the polygraph, which was a lie, Ferris asked for an attorney. And still, He was detained, arrested, and charged with rape and murder. Joe Dick testified at a preliminary hearing on August 25, 1998, against Pauley and Ferris, and implicated a possible seventh man. Despite Ferris and Pauley's alibis and a complete lack of evidence, the judge ruled there was sufficient evidence to proceed to trial. They were basing everything on the expected testimony of Joe Dick and Derrick Tice. Naturally, 3 days later, the forensic lab excluded Derrick Tice, Richard Pauley, and Jeff Ferris with DNA samples. On October 27, 1998, Derrick Tice was interrogated again. They wanted to know about this seventh man. They needed a new DNA sample. Derrick had failed his DNA test, as had the other men he accused, and this put him in the hot seat again. So he implicated yet another man named John Dancer. 25-year-old John Dancer had recently retired from the Navy and was working as an air conditioning technician in Philadelphia. He enlisted in November of 1990, served on the USS George Washington, and was discharged in July 1996. On November 4, 1998, John Dancer was arrested and interrogated. He did not confess. Like Pauley and Ferris, he had an alibi. He was in Philadelphia. Work records and ATM records verified this. Dancer took a polygraph, and investigators told him he failed. Dancer then said he wanted an attorney. It didn't matter that he had an alibi. Police kept him in custody, and he was charged with rape and murder. The next day, Derrick Tice changed his story and said Dancer wasn't there. There was someone else there, though, a black male who was already at Dan Williams's place when Derrick showed up. Then on November 27th, Derrick Tice said he wasn't present for the murder. He insisted he got all of his information from Dan Williams's preliminary hearing and facts from his attorneys. But then, on December 28, 1998, Derrick Tice testified that he, Dan Williams, Joe Dick, Eric Wilson, Richard Pauley, Jeff Ferris, and John Dancer all raped and murdered Michelle. It is crazy to see the dates line up and how Tice went back and forth. He was under extreme pressure. On January 22, 1999, in order to avoid the death penalty, Dan Williams pled guilty to capital murder and rape. In February, Dan Williams gave another statement to police implicating all the other men: Dick, Wilson, Tice, Pauley, Ferris, and Dancer. All the other dominoes who fell after his first false confession. He had never implicated anyone else before, not even Joe Dick, his roommate. The Norfolk police just brought him in when Daniel's DNA didn't match. Every single time the DNA didn't match, Detective Glenn Ford would lean harder on his latest suspect to get another name. On February 18, 1999, the forensic lab reported that they had tested the DNA from the crime scene with a more sophisticated technology. All 7 men were excluded with DNA samples from the crime scene. Not one match. But the wheels of justice kept turning anyway, in the wrong direction. On February 22, 1999, a woman named Karen contacted Detective Ford and said she'd received a letter from an inmate named Omar Ballard. In the letter, he confessed to killing Michelle. Karen had probably been his girlfriend at some point. The letter is vulgar and threatening. Basically, Omar Ballard told her he knew everything that goes on outside of the jail, and he can get anyone to kill her if he wants to. Throughout the letter, he threatens to have her killed if she doesn't send him a letter with nasty pictures of herself within a week. He said things like, "Bitch, you dead, and you'll be with Michelle." Towards the end of the first page, he wrote, "Remember that night I went to Mommy's house and Michelle got killed? Guess who did that? Me. Ha. It wasn't the first time. I'm good, ain't I? I don't give a fuck about nobody. If I was out, I would have killed that bitch down the street." Omar Ballard later told police he wrote the letter to Karen because he felt like she did him wrong. She hadn't done anything for him like she said she would, presumably once he went to jail. Omar Abdul Ballard was born in 1978, and his mother gave him up when he was 2 years old. He was raised in New Jersey and only completed the 10th grade, and he had a record before moving to Norfolk. On June 27, 1997, Ballard was at the same apartment complex Michelle Moore-Bosco lived in when he assaulted Melissa Morse with a baseball bat. After the assault, a mob chased Ballard around the complex. He ran to the Bosko apartment and Billy let him in. Remember, the Boskos had met Omar Ballard at the pool. He was friends with Tamika Taylor, Michelle's best friend. Billy Bosko refused to turn Omar Ballard over to the mob, and they left. Ballard was then banned from the complex, but he came back anyway, often sleeping on Tamika's couch. Billy had actually taken up for the man who would later rape and murder his wife. On July 8, 1997, Ballard was arrested for the assault of Melissa Morse with the baseball bat, but then he was out on bail. In the meantime, while detectives were busy framing innocent men, on July 17, 1997, Omar Ballard raped a 14-year-old girl around a mile away from Michelle's apartment. On July 25th, he was arrested again. He was not questioned about Michelle's rape and murder, even though Tamika Taylor had suggested maybe Ballard could have been the perpetrator. On July 15, 1998, he was found guilty of the rape of the 14-year-old girl. He was sentenced to 100 years, 59 of them suspended. On February 10th, Ballard pled guilty and was sentenced to 5 years for the assault on Melissa Morse. Detectives had a violent sexual offender connected to the Bosko case that they had willfully ignored. Finally, on March 2, 1999, Detective Glenn Ford confronted Omar Ballard about the letter he wrote. Ballard said he wasn't involved in the rape or murder. When shown pictures of the men who had been charged with Michelle's murder, Omar Ballard said he didn't know any of them except he did know Joe Dick, but that was because they were currently in the same part of the jail together. On March 4, 1999, the forensic lab confirmed that Omar Ballard's DNA matched all 3 samples from the crime scene. This was the only DNA match in the entire case. On the same day, Ford interviewed Omar Ballard again. Within 20 minutes, and without any pressure, Ballard confessed. He told police that he met Michelle through a mutual friend, Tamika Taylor. Ballard often stayed the night at Tamika's. She lived in the same apartment complex as Michelle. Ballard said that on July 7th he was feeling angry and frustrated with life. He had a sense there was nowhere he belonged. At around 11:30 p.m., he was on his way to Tamika Taylor's apartment when he stopped at Michelle's. Sometimes Tamika was at Michelle's place, so Ballard wanted to see if she was there. Michelle opened the door for Ballard and said Tamika wasn't there, and he felt like something bad was going to happen. But he didn't expect himself to rape and kill Michelle. But Michelle was friendly and told him there were drinks in the fridge and he could use the phone in the corner if he needed to. And then she went into the bedroom. Ballard claimed he grabbed a beer and then followed Michelle into the bedroom where they had sex. He also claimed they'd had sex one time before that. He got up to leave the bedroom and something just ticked in his head. He went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, which he accurately described, and went back into the bedroom. She was getting off the bed or was already off the bed, he couldn't remember, when Ballard stabbed her once in the chest. She fell to the floor, and he stabbed her 2 to 3 more times. He left her lying on the floor, said she was still alive and moaning, and dropped the knife in the bedroom. Before he left, Ballard stole $35 off the dining room table. Then he went to Tamika's and slept on her couch. Police showed up and questioned Tamika, but did not question Omar Ballard. When asked why he decided to stab Michelle, Ballard said he was drunk and thinking about his mother, who he resents a lot, because she gave him up. Ballard said he did not hit Michelle. When asked if he had anything else to add, Ballard said, "No, just them 4 people that opened their mouths is stupid." Ballard's confession lined up with the facts of the case. Michelle knew him and would feel comfortable letting him in her apartment. Ballard knew details only the killer would know. And he had been on a multi-week violent crime spree against women during the time Michelle was killed. On March 8th, Omar Ballard was charged with Michelle's rape and murder. He was the 8th and final man charged. 3 days later, he gave another statement to police. He talked about stopping at Michelle's on his way to Tamika's and how Michelle had offered him a drink and said he could use the phone. But in this statement, Ballard said he and Michelle did not talk in the living room. While she was in the bedroom, he went in there and raped her. This time, he admitted they had never had sex before. He said when she got off the bed and Ballard was about to leave, Michelle asked why he raped her. He said he snapped, turned around, grabbed her, started choking her, and she fell on the ground. He said he went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and went back to the bedroom. Michelle was getting up off the floor. He stabbed her. She fell back to the floor. Then he stabbed her 2 to 3 more times. When asked why he grabbed the knife, Ballard said, "I just blanked. I figured she was going to tell, so I was like, fuck it." Omar Ballard later said in an affidavit that during the interviews, Detective Ford asked him leading questions and would try to feed him details in an attempt to get the version of the crime that he wanted. Most importantly, Ballard said he committed the crime alone, but Ford kept trying to get him to say others were involved. Meanwhile, Joe Dick was offered a plea deal. If he pled guilty, he would be sentenced to life. If he went to trial and was found guilty, he would most likely receive the death penalty. Not knowing anything about Omar Ballard's confession yet, Dick's family and his attorneys suggested he take the deal. On April 21, 1999, in order to avoid the death penalty, Joe Dick pled guilty. As part of his deal, he had to testify against the other defendants. Joe Dick was sentenced to 2 terms of life without parole for his cooperation. On April 28, a judge denied Dan Williams' motion to withdraw his guilty plea, then sentenced Dan to 2 terms of life without parole. On May 7, 1999, after finding out about Ballard's confession letter, Derrick Tice refused to take a plea deal, refused to testify against the other men, and said he was innocent. A week later, after realizing that all they had left was Joe Dick's wobbly story, the state dropped all charges against Richard Pauley, Jeff Ferris, and John Dancer. Remember, these were the only men police could not coerce confessions from. The prosecutor, Damian Hansen, and Detective Glenn Ford said they still believed Pauley, Ferris, and Dancer were involved in the rape and murder. They said, quote, "Charging it and proving it are 2 different things." The state's theory was now that Williams, Dick, Wilson, Ferris, Pauley, Dancer, and Ballard gang-raped Michelle, then took turns stabbing her. On June 14, 1999, Eric Wilson's trial began. This is what the prosecution had settled on as their theory. All 8 men rushed Michelle's front door. Once inside, they struggled with her in the living room and dining room areas. They forced her down the hallway to the bedroom. There, they took turns raping and stabbing Michelle. The prosecution said that while all the defendants' stories were inconsistent, they were consistent at their core. They said that guilty people often lie or change their stories before they tell the truth. The prosecution said, quote, that the lack of DNA doesn't prove that a defendant wasn't at the scene. Eric Wilson's defense was allowed to bring up that Omar Ballard's DNA was found, but there was no DNA tying Wilson to the case. Wilson's recorded confession was played, but when he took the stand, he testified that he did not commit the crime. Eric testified that he made up his confession in order to stop Detective Ford from aggressively harassing him. He said, quote, "At that point in time, if they told me I killed JFK, I would have said that I handed Oswald the gun." Eric testified that Ford was, quote, "very aggressive, very threatening, very angry. I thought I'd better tell him what he wanted to hear. He started hitting me in the forehead with his finger." Joe Dick was the star witness. This is the story he told and would later tell at 2 other trials. Williams, Dick, Wilson, Tice, Ferris, Pauley, and Dancer met Ballard in the parking lot. They went to Michelle's apartment, covered the peephole, and she opened the door. All 8 men vaginally raped Michelle in her bedroom after they forced her down the hallway while she struggled. They all stabbed her, and Joe Dick was the last one to hold the knife. The blade was straight. On June 21st, Eric Wilson was acquitted of murder but found guilty of rape. He was sentenced to 8.5 years in prison. On February 8, 2000, Derrick Tice's trial began. His trial had been moved to Arlington due to pretrial publicity. The prosecution pretty much used the exact same playbook for Tice's trial. The defense was not allowed to bring in an expert witness about false confessions, but they were allowed to question Ford about his interrogation techniques. Joe Dick was the star witness again. Omar Ballard was called to the stand, but he denied any involvement. The judge did not allow Omar Ballard's 2 confessions to be introduced, and the defense was not allowed to question Ballard over the letter he sent to Karen or his past crimes against women. On February 11th, Derrick Tice was found guilty of capital murder and rape. He was sentenced to 2 life terms. On March 15, 2000, authorities met with Omar Ballard, who was still claiming to have acted alone in the murder. The prosecution needed Ballard to support their theory that 8 people were involved. They told him that they would drop the death penalty if he changed his story and implicated the other 7 men. Faced with death, Ballard accepted the deal, and on March 22nd, he pled guilty and was sentenced to 2 life terms. He gave a very short statement describing the crime based on what Ford implied had occurred. The following comes from Ford's notes in reference to their interview where Ballard gave a statement. He, Williams, Dick, Wilson, and Tice met in the apartment parking lot. They started talking about trying to get into Michelle's apartment. The Norfolk 4 told Ballard they tried to get into her apartment, but she wouldn't let them in. Ballard said he could get them in because he was friends with her. They all walked up to the apartment, and Ballard knocked on the door while the other 4 stood to the side. When Michelle opened the door, they all rushed in. They took her into the bedroom where they all raped and stabbed her. Ballard was the last one to leave the apartment. Ballard said this was the truth and that, quote, the others never told on him because he had told them he would come back and get them. The note said he hadn't told this story to the police before because, quote, he was already in prison and a member of the 5% and didn't want anyone to know he had been involved in a crime with white boys. In his notes, Ford mentions that Ballard was given a polygraph then sent back to jail. He did not pass the polygraph. It should be noted that Omar Ballard had never implicated any other person in the crime outside of this plea deal. He only did it to avoid the death penalty. In July 2000, Dan Williams' appeal was denied by the Virginia Court of Appeals. In his appeal, he had stated that he wanted to change his guilty plea at sentencing, but the judge ruled that Williams entered his guilty plea knowingly and voluntarily. In May 2002, Derrick Tice's conviction was reversed by the Virginia Court of Appeals, and a new trial was ordered. Tice had argued that his attorney should have been able to question Ballard about the letter to Karen. On January 27, 2003, Derrick Tice's retrial began in Alexandria. The same judge, Charles Poston, and prosecutor, Damian Hansen, were back. The prosecution told jurors, quote, people do not confess to something of this magnitude, this heinous, this vicious, without having participated in it. It's just not natural. It's just not reasonable. The prosecution played Derrick Tice's 18-minute confession tape and said, quote, just listen to the tone of his voice. Does that sound like someone who is being pressured into making a statement? The judge didn't allow the defense to admit Omar Ballard's confessions or statements. He did allow the defense to read Ballard's letter to Karen. The jury never heard about Detective Glenn Ford's history of eliciting false confessions because the judge ruled it was inadmissible. The judge said whether Ford obtained a false confession or not seemed to him to be relatively benign because he suspected that many police officers had done that, because we have all seen people who confess to anything. Omar Ballard was supposed to testify at Derrick Tice's trial, but both the prosecution and the defense attorney spoke with Ballard and convinced him not to testify. The state was worried that if Ballard testified, he wouldn't follow his deal and say that all 8 men had been involved. They were afraid Ballard would tell the truth and say he acted alone. About a month before Tice's retrial, Ford and another detective visited Ballard. Omar said he was going to testify truthfully, and Ford told him he needed to testify that he had nothing to say. The day before the retrial, Tice's attorneys visited Omar Ballard and said they didn't want him to say anything on the stand. Ballard later said in an affidavit that Tice's attorneys knew he was going to testify that Derrick Tice was innocent. Also, on the day before the retrial, prosecutors visited Omar Ballard and encouraged him to testify that he had, quote, nothing to say. Because he felt threatened and pressured, Ballard pled the fifth on the stand at the retrial. On August 31st, 2003, Derrick Tice was convicted of capital murder and rape and was immediately sentenced to 2 life terms without parole. In 2004, the Innocence Project got involved after there had been some publicity about the case. They were able to secure 3 large DC-based law firms who agreed to work on the case pro bono. In March 2005, Omar Ballard signed a sworn affidavit where he stated he raped and killed Michelle on his own. He said, quote, none of the other individuals who were charged with raping or killing Michelle were there or involved in any way. They are all innocent, and the ones who are in prison are serving long sentences for crimes they did not commit. Attorneys hired Academy Group, Inc., a forensic consulting firm, to put together a crime scene reconstruction report. On November 3, 2005, they released a 60-page report on their findings. Michelle Moore-Bosco was raped and murdered by Omar Ballard on July 8, 1997, in her Norfolk, Virginia apartment. Ballard was alone with Moore-Bosco when he killed her. He confessed to this homicide, and solely his DNA was found under her fingernails and in her vagina. Statements made by Ballard to police investigators were consistent with the physical evidence found at the crime scene and found during the victim's autopsy. There was no evidence linking Williams, Dick, Wilson, or Tice to this crime. Statements they made were not consistent with the physical evidence, the victim's wounds, or behavioral evidence. They had nothing to do with this matter and were charged only because they confessed to the crimes. If 8 men had attacked Michelle in a 700-square-foot apartment, there would have been more physical evidence left at the scene. The greater number of people present, the greater chance for more physical evidence. Essentially, think of the Locard's exchange principle. The principle holds that the perpetrator of a crime will bring something into the crime scene and leave with something from it, and that both can be used as forensic evidence. Basically, a killer will always leave something behind. And the Norfolk detectives only found evidence of one killer, but pursued other men when they could not get a DNA match. If there were multiple offenders, there would have been a mixture of semen and DNA. Furniture would have been knocked over or broken. And Michelle would have sustained much more injuries. Fighting off 8 men would mean more than one person's DNA would be under her fingernails. Restraint wounds would be evident. Michelle only had knife abrasions, as though one person held a knife on her. She had one set of bruises around her neck. If multiple people stabbed Michelle, there would be, quote, a greater variation in wound location, direction, size, and depth. And finally, a point that would be obvious to anyone, 8 people gang raping a woman in an apartment would have made a lot of noise. Also, someone would have noticed a group of 8 men around the complex. There is no way 8 men attacked Michelle without making noise and then managed to leave without being seen. In September 2005, Eric Wilson was released from prison after completing his sentence. He was required to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. He had a hard time on the outside. He had to hire an attorney and pay $10,000 to talk the electricians board into granting him a license. Because of his sex offender status, he couldn't work on certain properties, like schools or parks. On November 10, 2005, attorneys for the defendants and associates of the Innocence Project filed petitions for executive clemency and pardons with Virginia Governor Mark Warner. Eric Wilson filed a separate petition since he was no longer imprisoned. After the petitions were filed, the prosecutor, Damian Hansen, told the media that, quote, there is no new evidence of innocence. There are no unanswered questions. He said the Norfolk 4's claims were nothing more than, quote, sound bites invented by hired gun experts, which he referred to as the clemency gang. The governor didn't make a decision on the clemency, so the attorneys kept working. I told you to keep Joe's alibi for that night in your back pocket. Attorneys tracked down Joe Dick's supervisor from the time of the murder, Senior Chief Michael Ziegler. He was a highly decorated veteran who had been in the Navy for more than 20 years. The attorney spoke with Ziegler, who said he was absolutely certain that Joe Dick was on duty the night of the murder. He said there was absolutely no way he could have been involved. If you'll recall from earlier, Joe was the type of soldier who needed a lot of supervision, so Ziegler would check on him multiple times per shift. In 2006, Ziegler testified under oath that a few months after the murder, Joe Dick had been talking to Ziegler about how Dan Williams had been arrested. He told him how Dan was innocent, and now the detectives were asking him where he was on the night of the murder. Ziegler asked him where he was, and Joe said he was working. Ziegler said that would be easy enough to prove, so they went and looked at the schedule, and Joe was right. He had been on duty for 24 hours that day. Ziegler said when he found out that Joe Dick had been arrested, he went to his commanding officer and said he knew Joe was working the day of the murder and that he had nothing to do with it. Ziegler was also worried Joe Dick would make a false confession. Ziegler was told that the Navy would look into it. A few days later, he was told that Joe had made a confession and was pleading guilty. There was nothing the Navy could do. They said Ziegler should be ready to answer any questions police had for him, but no one ever spoke to him, which baffled him. This part had always bothered me. If Joe Dick had an alibi, whether or not the Norfolk police chose to check it out, why wouldn't his superior officer have come forward? Well, he did. It's absolutely sickening. Not only did Ziegler give Joe Dick an alibi, he knew him well enough to be worried he could be tricked into a false confession. And the police knew this. They just didn't care. This testimony was a big deal because Joe Dick's statements were the basis of the prosecution's entire theory. Ziegler told the New York Times that there's no way Joe snuck off the ship, committed the crime, and snuck back on board. He said, quote, "The Joseph Dick I knew couldn't chew bubblegum and tie his shoes at the same time. There's no way in hell anyone can convince me Joseph Dick could pull that off." Also in 2006, Omar Ballard testified under oath that he killed Michelle. No one else helped him. Attorneys obtained expert opinions on the unlikelihood that the Norfolk Four were involved in Michelle's murder. 2 forensic pathologists found it was virtually impossible for more than one person to have murdered Michelle. They said the prosecution's theory was extremely implausible. An expert in DNA analysis found that the absence of DNA evidence connecting the Norfolk Four to the murder made it overwhelmingly likely that they were not involved. Law enforcement experts, including a former FBI agent, found that Omar Ballard acted alone and the Norfolk Four were not involved. A false confessions expert found that the Norfolk Four's confessions were completely false. The expert's conclusion was based on multiple reasons, but the main 2 were that the confessions were completely inconsistent with the crime scene and with each other, and the Norfolk Four were threatened with the death penalty if they didn't confess. 4 former attorney generals for Virginia examined the case and found that there had been a miscarriage of justice. Now, more than 20 members of the Richmond chapter of the Society of Former Special Agents of the FBI examined the case independently and concluded that the Norfolk Four were innocent. Attorneys contacted jurors from Eric Wilson and Derrick Tice's trials and showed them evidence they hadn't been shown at trial. The following is everything that had been suppressed from the jury: Omar Ballard's sworn testimony that he was the sole perpetrator of the crime, Ballard's chilling letter in which he admitted to killing Michelle Moore-Bosco, Ballard's crime spree against women at the time he murdered Michelle, including Ballard's physical assault of a woman in her apartment complex 2 weeks before the murder, and the rape and attempted strangulation of a 14-year-old girl just 10 days after Michelle's murder, the lead detective's history in eliciting false confessions, expert testimony on how the coercive interrogation tactics resulted in inconsistent statements which bear the hallmarks of false confessions, Joseph Dick's alibi confirming that he was on duty at the time of the crime, and finally, the expert testimony from a crime scene reconstruction analyst and a forensic pathologist stating this was a single perpetrator crime committed by Omar Ballard. 10 jurors then wrote a joint letter saying they would not have voted for conviction if they had seen all the evidence. Quote, "All the available evidence shows clearly that Omar Ballard raped and killed Michelle Bosco by himself. We thus ask you that you grant clemency to Joseph Dick, Derrick Tice, Eric Wilson, and Daniel Williams. We recognize that we played a key role in putting Eric Wilson in prison, and we understand that you are now the only person who can clear his name and release the other innocent men. We were faced with a difficult decision when we deliberated, and we know that you are faced with a difficult decision too. But we believe that clearing the names of these 4 sailors is the only right thing to do, and we urge you to act on these clemency petitions promptly." On November 27, 2006, the Virginia Circuit Court overturned Derrick Tice's second conviction due to ineffective counsel. The state appealed the Circuit Court's decision to the Virginia Supreme Court, who then reinstated Tice's conviction. On August 6, 2009, Virginia Governor Timothy Kane granted Daniel Williams, now 37 years old, Derrick Tice, 39 years old, and Joe Dick, 33 years old, conditional pardons. He did not declare their innocence. Instead, just reduced their statement to time served. Kane said the men have not conclusively established their innocence, and therefore that an absolute pardon is not appropriate. Because they were only conditionally pardoned, all 3 men were put on parole for 20 years and had to register as convicted sex offenders and violent offenders. They were released, but they still had convictions on their records. Michelle's parents, Jack and Carol, were devastated by the pardons. After all this time, they still believed the Norfolk Four were guilty. The Moore said Kane had chosen to ignore the facts and history of this case, and that it's truly shameful and a disservice to the citizens of Virginia and our family that the decisions of the courts have been ignored and confessed rapists and murderers are being set free. On September 14, 2009, a U.S. District Judge overturned Derrick Tice's convictions for Tice having ineffective counsel. The defense should have moved to suppress his confession since Derrick had asked for an attorney. On October 27, 2010, former Detective Glenn Ford was convicted by a U.S. District Court on 2 counts of extortion and 1 count of making false statements to the FBI, which was unrelated to the Norfolk 4 case. Going all the way back to the 90s, he had been taking bribes from criminals, and in exchange he helped them get released on bond or helped reduce their sentences by lying to prosecutors and judges that they had helped with the investigation. When questioned by the FBI, he lied about it. In February 2011, 57-year-old Robert Glenn Ford was sentenced to almost the maximum time allowed, 12.5 years, but he was released this past October 2021 on the 18th. U.S. Attorney Neil McBridge said, quote, "It's a sad day when somebody called upon to enforce the law betrays the trust, betrays not only his fellow cops, but the court system, the public, and the law he took an oath to uphold." On August 4th, 2011, prosecutors finally announced they were dismissing charges. Derrick Tice was officially exonerated. On September 26, 2016, U.S. District Judge John Gibney said, quote, "No sane human being would have convicted Williams and Dick." He said the state had 60 days to retry Williams and Dick, and if they didn't, the men would be exonerated. Then the Virginia Attorney General, Mark Herring, conceded errors in the initial investigation and withdrew his office's long-standing opposition to their claims of innocence. The state withdrew all charges, and on October 26, 2016, Dan Williams and Joe Dick were exonerated. In November 2016, Attorney General Herring told the Norfolk police to video all interrogations and confessions relating to murders. According to the New York Times, the Norfolk Four's attorneys continued fighting for absolute pardons because they carried greater weight than court rulings and were essential to helping the men rebuild their lives and reputations. Finally, on March 21, 2017, Governor Terry McAuliffe granted absolute pardons to the Norfolk Four. Their names were removed from the sex offender and felony offender lists. A spokesman for McAuliffe said, "These pardons close the final chapter on a grave injustice that has plagued these 4 men for nearly 20 years. Eric Wilson released a press release that said, "I speak for all 4 of us in expressing our deepest thanks to Governor McAuliffe, who has given us our lives back with these full pardons. We have been haunted by these wrongful convictions for 20 years, which have created profound pain, hardships, and stress for each of us and our families. We now look forward to rebuilding our reputations and our lives." Michelle's mom, Carol, said, "It's hard to believe that, hearing the confessions and knowing the details of this case, these men were not involved with the murders of our daughter. The governor and the judicial system who worked so hard to free these killers will have it on their conscience if any of them commit another violent crime." The Norfolk Four filed a civil suit against the city and state for their wrongful convictions. In December 2018, they all settled. The city paid $4.9 million, and the state paid $3.5 million. Last week, I presented you with the case of a young woman who was failed by the justice system in every step. If her killer had been held accountable when he first offended, Shannon Melindy would be alive. This week, another young woman was failed. Michelle Moore-Bosco is lost in all of the incredible detail of the convictions, appeals, and pardons of the Norfolk Four. Her family was immensely hurt by the pardons, and understandably. For years, they believed a lie that grew bigger with each telling. Can you imagine being her husband or mother and continuing to get calls about a new suspect? The worst thing that had ever happened in their lives just kept getting worse. Billy Bosko was repeatedly called to court to tell the story of the horrific night he found his young wife dead. I didn't even recite all the different confessions the men gave. None of them matched. All of them are so hard to read. But I can only imagine how her family must have felt just listening to the confessions without context. And worst of all, the justice system didn't just fail the Norfolk Four, as well as the other 3 men who had their charges dropped. It targeted them. Norfolk police, and specifically Detective Ford, could never just admit they were wrong. Despite all evidence to the contrary, they made this crime so much bigger and so much worse. They inflamed the public against these men by calling it a gang rape. Rape and murder are horrific enough, but when you say a young woman was gang raped, you may as well hand out the pitchforks and torches. And it's not just the police or the inherently corrupt, narcissistic detective. It was the prosecutors who went to trial knowing about Omar Ballard's confession. It was the judge who suppressed all the evidence. It was the appellate judges who refused to look at further evidence. 4 men lost a decade of their lives in prison and even longer branded as gang rapists. The money they received in compensation will never be enough. These 4 young men had served their country faithfully and had their lives and careers ruined by the justice system of the very country they served. No one wins in this case. These men will never get their lives back. Michelle Moore-Bosco was brutally raped and murdered. Her husband and parents got justice for her killer, but don't really believe the other men accused are innocent. So no, they didn't get justice either. All because corrupt police would not admit they were wrong. 7 lives ruined, 3 more almost ruined, a generation of people wronged. And today, only half of our states believe that custodial interrogations should even be recorded. As far as we have come, we have so much further to go. Southern Fried True Crime is written, hosted, and produced by me, Erica Kelley. Today's episode was researched by the one and only Haley Gray, with some additional research by me. Southern Fried's original music is by Rob Harrison of Gamma Radio, and the original graphic art is by Coley Horner. Please submit case suggestions to southernfriedtruecrime@gmail.com. I do not accept suggestions on social media, and I apologize if I'm unable to answer your email. I get dozens of suggestions a week, and it takes a long time to go through and check out each case. Thank you all so much for sending in these suggestions. I truly get my most interesting cases from listener suggestions, so keep them coming. Don't forget to come to our new Facebook group. Search for Southern Fried True Crime Fans Discussion Group. We still worship our patron saint Dolly Parton, share fun memes and delicious recipes. Our group is a safe and fun corner of Facebook, and by God, we mean it when we say no shit-asses allowed. It is not just a motto, it's how we run the group. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season and best wishes for a happy new year. I won't be back until the middle of January. I'm hosting a film festival in Atlanta in January and need time to prepare. It's the only film festival dedicated to true crime in the U.S. Follow me on social media for more information. If you enjoyed today's show, don't forget to subscribe and please tell a friend or rate and review on iTunes. I'm also on most large platforms like iHeart, Stitcher, and Spotify, as well as Stitcher Premium, where you can listen ad-free. Until next time, thanks so much for listening. Y'all take care.